Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to Safer Schools Through Design, a discussion with the American Institute of Architects about how design and policy can help make our schools more secure. I'm Stayton Bonner, a contributing writer to Wired magazine. With me are Jim Brewer, chief lobbyist for the American Institute of Architects in Washington, D.C., Jay Brotman, a managing partner at Svigals Partners architect firm in New Haven, Connecticut, who led the design of the new Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, and Karina Ruiz, a principal at BRIC Architecture in Portland and the chair of the AIA's Committee on Architecture for Education. We're here today to discuss an increasing issue in America, how to better protect schools against gun violence. Currently in the U.S., there are endless debates about how to implement school security. People arguing for everything from arming teachers to building ballistic shelters in hallways to installing overhead smoke canisters that deploy fog during attacks. In 2017, according to an analysis by HIS market research firm, sales of security equipment and services to schools reached $2.7 billion in the U.S., a figure expected to rise in the wake of shootings like the 2018 tragedy at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. Overall, however, few communities can afford to implement a wide range of security measures. So in order to make more informed decisions, they're turning for help to an increasingly important voice in school safety, architects. Trained to bring together different experts to examine how physical spaces can both protect and inspire, architects are now working with communities across all spectrums to design schools that safeguard children while not feeling like fortresses. In 2018, following the school shootings in Parkland, Florida, and Santa Fe, Texas, architects and members of the AIA began working with state governments in Florida and Texas to identify enhanced security solutions for schools and communities. In August, AIA members also met with key government officials at the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Education, and the Federal Commission on School Safety, offering insight on how design can enhance safety and security at schools. Ultimately, architects in the AIA are working with communities across the U.S. on three main elements to design safer schools: creating federal guidelines for school safety, deciding on how best to implement security measures, and perhaps most importantly, figuring out how to create nurturing environments that promote individual and community well-being in order to hopefully prevent tragedies from ever happening in the first place. Overall, the idea is to support crime prevention through environmental design. In order to create a safer school, you have to think holistically about a school, something architects have been doing in communities for decades. Now, from the beginning of projects, they pull together landscape architects, security specialists, hardware people, and camera people. Then they help communities navigate the tough questions and find solutions. Today, we're going to have a conversation on stage about how architects are working to design safer schools. Then at the end of our session, we'll open up the discussion to answer questions from the audience. There's a microphone right here. Jim, this is the 20th anniversary for Columbine. Where have we gotten to in terms of a national consensus on school safety? Give us the national context.
Sure. So as everybody, unfortunately remembers September 11th, 2001, everybody can probably also remember the fact that what has happened since then, and specifically state, local, and federal government's response to that. And one of the primary tactics to mitigate terrorist attacks has been a design-centered approach. From our airports, mass transit hubs, public buildings, private buildings, all of the above, design has been a huge focus of how to mitigate terrorist attacks. But unfortunately, the same can't be said, to your point, in terms of it being almost the 20th anniversary of Columbine. The same can't be said for our approach on how to redesign, or take a systematic approach as we have since 9/11, take a systematic approach as it relates to redesigning our schools, whether it be retrofitting them with technology or building new ones, designing new ones, and building new ones. There are, I think, roughly about 220,000 students that have experienced gun violence of some type on their campuses in the last 20 years since Columbine. And it's a real tragedy when you think about it in terms of whether those students have been hurt themselves, either mentally or physically, or in any way you think about it, it's a tragedy. And part of the solution, design unfortunately can't prevent any type of school violence and mass shooting, so forth. But part of the solution needs to be a design-centered approach. There's 122,000 schools in the country, K through 12, public and private, and not enough of them not enough of them have been redesigned to take into account that we need to have safe schools and measures within that. You'll, of course, hear from Karina and Jay on how architects are best suited and have been doing this. And I think that's one of the other good points to note is that architects have been doing this for a long time. It's obviously Columbine has been one of the markers in the tragic history of school violence, but architects have been doing this for even longer than that. So the bottom line is that we need a systematic approach like we've taken since 9/11 to retrofit and then design our schools in a way that is going to make them safe, but also maintain them as a positive learning environment.
Thanks. Jay, you designed the new Sandy Hook Elementary School in 2013. Tell me, how do you design a school that's safer?
Well, I think that's the big question today, isn't it? Using Sandy Hook as an example, December 2012, this town of Newtown suffered one of America's greatest tragedies, and it happened to our children, and it happened in one of our schools. So obviously, the first thing people want to do when something like that happens is protect our children. And so the original theme was already thinking about building a fortress, to put our children in and protect our children. But you as educators and as we as architects understand that a fortress is no place to grow the next generation of responsible citizens of the United States. We want to be our next generations. Studies have shown that what children really need is a inspiring, nurturing environment to learn in, an environment that has access to nature, has access to natural light, and even more importantly, is connected to its community. And a fortress does not afford that kind of a place to be. In Newtown, the days after this terrible tragedy, where the town is inundated from people from all over the world, the small little New England town had to cope with healing with the victims and the families. But at the same time, the group of them had to look at what do we do about our school? What do we do for these children? What's going to be next? They had to go back to school. Fortunately, the neighboring town had an empty school, and so in the first few weeks, they were able to fix that school up and make it available for these children. But then they had to address what do they do at their building? It's on their building, on their campus. They even looked at, they knew they couldn't put students back. They couldn't ask the parents to put students back into that school. It was just something they couldn't imagine doing. They also looked at across town, are there additional sites, someplace else to put this school and create this community again? And they noticed within the first few months that the area, the community of Sandy Hook, which is a part of Newtown, Connecticut, was already feeling the effects of this community that they had, this school that they had, leaving this part of town. So they realized they had to come back to this same site. And they had to reuse the same site and rebuild this neighborhood. The loss of the school after the tragic loss they had would be just too much to bear. At that point, they brought us in as architects. And as architects, they're asking us to bring in those 4 watchwords of security design: deter, detect, delay, and protect. And it was our job to look holistically at this problem and come up with solutions that not only addressed those security issues, but address the bigger issues of what you want in a school, that welcoming, nurturing kind of place that children can grow and be responsible citizens of the world. And that's the architect's role, is to take all of these priorities and put them together holistically and come up with a design that answers both these questions. We want to have both these things happening and being the positive results. In this process at Sandy Hook, instead of hardening our schools and putting up these impenetrable barriers, we used a process called layering. So we were layering our defenses and providing the environment that we want. And so what does layering mean? You can start with the outer layer, In this case, the perimeter of the project itself. This is a beautiful New England town set in wooded hills, with that ubiquitous chapels, steeples sticking up above the trees. Just a beautiful place. So we had a lot of advantages. We had natural features that we could use to create the perimeter around our building. The hills, the retaining walls, wetlands, forested wetlands. And then within that, to finish that barrier, we simply had to put in some nice fencing along the way, and really it was all decorative from there. You're also able to create layers by how you put the building on the site. In this case here, the entrance to the site is far away from the building, giving the occupants of the building plenty of time to see who's coming and know who's coming and who's being aware. And you can see around the outside of this picture, they're just standard features. Looks like a normal school. You can also use traffic as one of your layers. In this case here, we are able to segregate the buses. So only the buses were allowed to come around to the front of the building, and we put all the staff in one parking lot. It is just simply done by normal parking devices and fobs, nothing fancy. That way you put the visitors all in one area, and it allows you to focus your observational techniques that you may want to do right in that one area. So it limits the scope that you have to do, and you've controlled your site in a meaningful way. The next thing you want to think about is how do you buffer this public area in front of the building to the private area that you want to bring students in. And for this project, we were able to put a rain garden in front of the school to create that buffer. And across that rain garden are 3 entrances. So we limit how you get into the school and focus where that is. And the center one there is the main entrance to the building. What is a rain garden, you may ask? Well, it's actually a moat of sorts that collects the rainwater off the roof and naturally infiltrates it back into the soils. So it's a really environmentally sustainable practice that we know we needed to have in this project. The difference here is that we planted that natural swale with natural landscaping and put a nice rock bed on it, so we get a rock river that comes through it. And then across that swale, that rain garden, we built these little bridges. So that brought this reminiscent of this New England town, the rivers, the bridges. The town began as a mill river and a mill town in colonial times. And so you can see that reflects the town and the image that they have too. So this is the main entrance to the building that everybody comes through. All the visitors come through here. Looks fairly normal. We did employ some ballistic glass. There are some cameras that you can see in that area, but otherwise it looks like any other glassed front entry. You can get to the first door, but you have to be buzzed into the next door where the security is. You can see we have windows across the front of the school so that there can be natural observation from the inside so that people can see what's happening in the parking lot and who's approaching the building. It gives them time to react accordingly if that need be. So if you do these layers and put them in, you can create these wonderful spaces inside where you can now open up the windows, have plenty of glazing. These areas are protected. You bring that natural daylight into the school, and what we like to bring in our schools is natural nature into the building, in this case here, even figurative nature, trees and leaves are something that's positive to a learning environment. The building itself is another opportunity to create additional layers. In this case here, we're able to create a segregated area for the evening and weekend programs, because sometimes the schools, these are community buildings, they want to be used year-round and all week. And then we were able to create wings for the classrooms and even put doors that, in case of emergency, those doors would automatically close, creating another layer, an opportunity to delay any activities that you don't want to come through that spot. The classroom really becomes the last layer of defense, and we are really we think about modern schools today that they need to be open and accessible, and Karina's going to talk a little bit about the psychology of that. So our classrooms wanted to be open, and as you walk down the corridors, you want to see into them. We were able to employ some glass windows so you can look in. The glass was designed so that a good portion of the room was not visible, and you wouldn't be able to, so it gives an opportunity for the children and occupants to hide. The door itself is a critical design of this layer. In this case here, it's an open door policy in the school, so the doors are always open on a magnetic hold open device, and if there an emergency occurs, the button is pushed, the doors automatically close, automatically lock through a manual system. The teacher doesn't have to go up to the door, put themselves in harm's way to protect the children themselves. So we've really created all these layers, this last layer down in here too, and we feel does a wonderful job of protecting the students without putting up barriers and barriers.
Jay talked about security features at Sandy Hook. Karina, can you talk about what architects are doing in addition to that, create a holistic security for schools?
Sure. Thanks, Stayton. I think both of you talked about sort of our natural fear as anyone who loves a child to want to protect them, right? To kind of create these fortresses where kids feel safe and we believe them to be safe. But as Jay said, if you think about those interventional strategies, those safety and security measures, we want those to be as inconspicuous as possible. You know, I remember early days after the Parkland tragedy, speaking with some of the survivors, and when the thing that stuck with me is they talked about, she talked about when they came back to school, they were forced to put their belongings in clear backpacks and walk through metal detectors, and she said, more than anything, that felt like we were being punished when we had done nothing wrong, right? And so it's important for us, I think, as architects who are being asked by communities who have this really rational fear to talk about the need to address those in the way that Jay talked about, but then also to think about, first and foremost, our schools need to be places of learning. They need to be places where students can grow and thrive. And they should be filled with really inspiration and wonder for students. And so we at the AIA, specifically the Committee on Architecture for Education, really took this charge seriously. After the tragedy at Parkland, I think it was a game changer for the nation as a whole, but certainly the architectural community. As Jim said earlier, this is something we've been dealing with for over 20 years. And one of the unfortunate things is society's attention is episodic, right? We see these major events and we respond to them. And so there's a heightened level of awareness and a heightened level of interest. But this latest tragedy at Parkland and then shortly thereafter in Santa Fe, high school here in Texas, it really changed the game in the sense that it brought to bear that design of these interventional strategies wasn't enough. That what we really needed to do was talk about the more curative aspects of safety and security and ensuring that we think about safety from a whole child perspective, right? So how can design be a partner in the conversation about providing more access to mental health services and creating environments of positive social-emotional learning? And how can we ensure that we're using design and that our buildings are cultivating community and creating cultures of care in our schools? So we brought together a really wide array of participants. There were survivors from Marjory Stoneman Douglas at Parkland. We had teachers from Sandy Hook, obviously architects. We had first responders, mental health professionals, school counselors, administrators, pretty much everyone involved in schools. And our role as architects was to facilitate the conversation. I think oftentimes it's our training that serves us most, not in terms of what we deliver as an outcome, but in terms of the process that we use. Our training is such that we are taught how to bring together wide varieties of people from different perspectives to solve wickedly complicated problems in beautiful and elegant ways. That's kind of the essence of our training. And quite frankly, there could be no more wicked problem than this one, right? So as we came together, we focused really, like I said, on being sure that we were addressing kind of that holistic approach to safety and security. Some of the elements that you're starting to see come out of that sort of philosophy is this idea that counseling and access to mental health shouldn't be tucked away in an admin office down a hall quite frankly, associated with discipline in most cases, but rather we want to see those resources put on display in places where students gather. So not only so that way they can have more ready access to them, but then so those folks that are charged with helping to support the mental health of our students in our schools and our teachers, quite frankly, are seeing them more regularly. You know, in this case, you can see this is a commons, and the admin offices and the counseling offices specifically are right off of that commons. So, you know, a counselor looking through the glass there can say, hey, you know, I've noticed Jay's looked a little down the last couple of days. I should go and connect with him, should go and talk to them. So that's a key feature that, that we've been talking about. You know, the issue of transparency in glass is one that is hotly debated in the design of schools. It's a conversation we get into regularly. And I think what our position is that it needs to be intentional, right? I think glass serves a couple of purposes that are positive to safety and security. One is, quite frankly, the more regular occurrences that we see of violence in our school, bullying and fights. Glass can help curb that because you have more eyes on the street, right? You've got passive supervision. Folks in classrooms and in offices that are readily and regularly occupied can see into common spaces. Hallways, typically kind of that are dark and dank, now can be light and have eyes on them. But you also need to balance that with the very real threat that we have to deal with, unfortunately, of someone of malintent coming into a school and wanting to cause harm. So in a space like this, actually what you can't see in the classroom behind this extended learning area is that this classroom isn't shaped like a traditional rectangle. Rather, it's a fat L. So there's a whole portion of the classroom that's kind of tucked back behind that piece of cabinetry where an entire class can gather and have an area of refuge outside of the line of sight of the window. So it's in our mind, it isn't sacrificing one to gain student safety, but rather being able to have one complement the other. We're also seeing that same need for creating spaces of gathering, you know, along student streets or places where of intersection for students to gather, right? So we want students to feel a part of a community. We want everyone, quite frankly, in the school to feel a part of that community. So we want to be able to create both intentional and somewhat accidental places of interaction. Jay talked about it at Sandy Hook, right? So if you see kind of that middle band there between one side of the building and the classroom wings, that's the student street at Sandy Hook. And the idea is that you provide those areas of connection, that transparency or the glass, the windows on either side, to be able to allow occupants of the building and even those that are allowed, you know, in as visitors to be able to see to and through spaces, to not only bring that natural light in, but also be able to feel connected to one another. That starts to give us a shared sense of accountability. So what research has shown is if you have that shared sense of accountability, you're more likely to ask for help when you see someone in need of help, right? So it's the see something, say something, but you're more compelled to do that if you feel connected to your community. And so it's features like this that can help achieve that. The other element that you know became very clear in the conversations we were having was our kids are hurting. You know, we see incredibly high incidences of drug abuse and stress and teen suicide attempts. And what that's telling us is that our kids are stressed. Quite frankly, the teachers are stressed. And so another aspect that we're talking about really that is core to the emotional safety and security of students is being able to provide areas of respite, meditation, having a calm, warm environment, elements like bringing nature into the building, biophilic design, so being able to have elements of nature, both physical elements, like in this case a green wall, but also being able to mimic nature through the use of for example, the columns that you saw in a previous photograph that looked like a tree house, right? So I think it's kind of a combination of all of those things, And when you layer that with the interventional strategies of safety and security, the more sort of CPTED, crime prevention through environmental design, and then provide these auxiliary support services and having an intentional design that marries the two of those, I think that's when we're our most successful in terms of school design.
Sandy Hook was a new school design. Most communities are not going to be able to build new schools. Instead, they're going to look at retrofitting existing buildings. What are the challenges those schools are facing?
Start?
Yep. So obviously, there's the biggest challenge is funding. There's all these schools out there. The funding they get comes in small increments, and so the natural reaction is to grab the latest security device and put that in your school, and wait for your next round of funding and put another security device in the school. So that sort of Band-Aid on top of Band-Aid approach is not going to effectively get you to where you want to be to create a school that can be both secure, safe, as well as nurturing and enlivening and full of daylight. What we'd like to see happen is to take that first round of funding and put a team together, hopefully in our sense, led by an architect, but bringing on the security folks and any other specialized consultants you need. Get that team to create a master plan for each and every school in your community, because they're all different. Every one of them will have a different set of circumstances. An urban school will have a different set of circumstances than a community school, than a rural school. So you get that master plan together, and then it'll give you your roadmap as the money does come in, that you're able to implement those strategies that are the most important, they're going to do the most bang for your buck, that's going to give you that value for each of those dollars that come in. The benefit to that master plan is that you can also use that master plan to go to your funding sources, and you can show them what you need, what you're going to accomplish when you meet that need, and they'll understand why they need to then release the money and get it into your hands and let you follow through with the design improvements that you need for these existing schools.
Yeah, I think to answer your question, Stayton, I think there are a couple of things that school districts and schools across the nation and architects face as challenge. One is just awareness, right? What are the right things to do? I've talked to, over the course of my career, a number of my clients that are being inundated by, the latest gadget that promises to keep our kids safe, right? And certainly it's compelling when they have communities and parents coming in and sort of demanding this from them, but it also, they're stuck. They don't know, you can't Google like what is the perfect school design, right? And so thinking about being able to equip our communities, our nation as a whole, as parents, as teachers, as the designers of schools, about sort of this need to take this balanced approach. What is the evidence telling us is effective, and being able to get that in the hands of those kind of doing the work. I think, Jay, you hit the nail on the head, that it's about these conversations, right? I think we know for a fact that there is no one-size-fits-all solution, that we have to be able to respond to the needs and the wants and priorities of each individual community. And so part of it is the conversation. Our nation's stock is hundreds of years old, right? So you talked about the fact that a lot of what we were showing here were new buildings. This is a 100-year-old building that was renovated to incorporate some of those same features that we were talking about. I think the second challenge that we're facing as a nation, you talked about funding as a whole. I think the other challenge we have is the inequity in the funding that we have across the nation. So most of these projects come from a capital improvement bond that's either at the state level or at the local level. But there are many school districts that don't have that advantage, right? And so even within the state, you have gross disparities in what they're able to provide to safeguard their students. And so I think those are probably the two biggest challenges that we see, and where we need some policy help, quite frankly.
Mm. We've heard a lot about what architects are doing to design safer schools. Jim, let's talk about legislation. What policies are needed to create safe schools going forward?
Absolutely. So there was an interesting study that was done about a year after the Sandy Hook tragedy. And it surveyed architecture and design firms across the country. And one of the primary questions that was asked is, hey, have you heard from school administrators in your area? Has there been an uptick in requests for your services, subject to the fact that there was a national awareness at that point, or at least in the months following Sandy Hook, of we need to redesign our schools? And the unfortunate answer was little to none, which is one of the primary motivations for AIA in trying to tackle this issue and wanting to make sure that if a survey like that is done again, that there is not that type of response. And so to that point, we have come up with two policy solutions that we feel like would help to address why that answer was given and why school administrators would necessarily not be reaching out to architecture and design firms. And one of the, actually, before we go into the two policy solutions, let's talk about, to this point, both at the federal and state level, what has been the focus from a policy solutions level. And a lot of it is focused on personnel with school resource officers and training school faculty, mental health support, and in some case, physical security enhancements. Primarily a lot of school administrators, to Jay's point earlier, what is the newfangled technology? And many times it's the cameras and metal detectors that comes up first. And just to be clear, we are not saying that these are unnecessary solutions or ones that shouldn't be explored or taken for that matter. These are absolutely all part. There's just like you're taking a holistic approach with designing a school, there needs to be a holistic approach with trying to solve this issue. But if you look at or actually, let's go back real quick. Well, in any event, on the state level, somewhat of the same thing in terms of what you're seeing resources go to. But the bottom line is that the resources, as I was saying earlier, in terms of needing a systematic approach towards that we've seen since 9/11 in terms of redesigning and retrofitting our existing building stock and then new buildings. But unfortunately, resources aren't going to design at the state or federal level. So to help that process along, and Jay mentioned it perfectly in the sense that there is a funding issue. We know that there is a lack of resources across every state and every locality. Whether you're talking about a grouping of rural schools or if it's more urban or some type of suburban area. But the two policies that we feel like could help move the needle in the long run, like I was saying earlier, help to make sure that answer to that survey question is not that school administrators would not be asking for help to figure out. I mean, Karina, you mentioned it, and unfortunately we have heard of many instances of school administrators and local officials Googling after some type of violence or mass shooting at their school, and because they don't know what to do. And to y'all's point earlier, that's where architects can come in. And so on these two policies, one would be getting funding for design services to be able to have, Jay, to your point earlier, have that first conversation, bring together community stakeholders, security experts, first responders, that type thing, to be able to say, hey, we do have a budget for something like this, but we don't know what we can spend our money on, what we should be spending our money on at this point, knowing that there may not be a bond coming down the path, or that funding from the state legislature may not be at what it could be, or if it is, how do we spread the money across in a way that's going to be advantageous and equitable for all schools, to your point, Karina. So that's one thing that we're looking to do is make design design services eligible for federal funding. The second thing goes to one of the issues, and I think one of the we've been talking about it the entire time, is the lack of information and that school administrators have, and it is a real issue, and it's kind of incredible when you think about it that again using Columbine as one of the major markers of school mass shootings, the history of that tragic issue. It's kind of amazing if you think about it that we don't have a one-stop shop resource and for school administrators to go. Some states have kind of tackled this issue in the sense of having informational resources and best practices. I think, frankly, in the age of Googling, it's more important than ever that we have some type of unbiased, credible resource. And so, in our minds, that resource could be housed in the federal government level. Having information coming into it from all types of resources, from architects, from engineers, from landscape architects, from interior designers, from first responders, security experts, the same type of people that should be in those meetings on the local level. We need them feeding information into this clearinghouse so that local and state officials can access it and have that conversation with themselves, and then hopefully be able to use it productively. So that, I mean, not in a nutshell, but it's certainly in a tip of the iceberg type fashion are two policy solutions that we're looking at so far as trying to move the needle on this and truly help state and local officials in the short term. I think in the long term there are some other things that we're looking about. In the short term, these are things that when we have talked with Republicans and Democrats, I think this is the last point I'll make. When we've talked with Republicans and Democrats, it's interesting because we're aware, obviously, of the two sides that happen on the gun issue. We're aware of the two sides and everybody going to their respective corners on mental health issues. We're aware of the debate, obviously, in the two sides as it relates to school resource officers or arming teachers, that type of thing. The bottom line being there are opposing camps in all of those type of solutions that are discussed post-school mass shooting. However, if you look at the history of when people talk about, well, we need to design our schools to be safer for students and teachers, both Republicans and Democrats agree. And so from our perspective, this is a huge opportunity. Whereas we may be arguing all across the political spectrum as it relates to these other solutions, and unfortunately gridlock may be developing on those, we still have one that is a major part of the solution that should be advanced. And to that end, we think these two specific policies could help do that.
Great. Well, thanks, guys. So at this point, we're going to open it up to the audience. If there are any questions, please come up. The microphone's right here. Also, check online.
Hey, good morning. Hi, welcome to Austin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So I live here, so I'm grateful to everybody who is out of town and joining our great city. And we're also in a legislative session. So, and hardening of schools is one of the topics that is being discussed. And one thing, thank you for talking about, what can schools do interimly, and, whether they have a bond project or have received some external funding. And thank you for talking about, gathering the professionals together to begin having that conversation that really bridges that design and safety collective conversation. But in terms of, while that's happening or while that work is happening, what can schools, what can administrators do? How can they use existing spaces and places that they have while they're planning and while they're meeting? Are there things that they can do with existing resources that they have, moving bookshelves around, or, again, clearing like window spaces around? Just what are some of those practical things that, as we leave here today, we can go back to our communities and say, hey, if you can do one or two or three of these things while we're meeting, while we're planning to meet, these are some things that could help us, as we're going in that direction.
I'll start. I think a lot of it is kind of relocation of some resources, right? Taking advantage of the spaces you have, especially on a lot of mid-century schools. The admin is away from the front wall of the building, right? Where you can see the street, you can see the parking lot. So even something as simple as moving your administration, excuse me, closer to your front door so that you do have those eyes on the street is something you can do. Same thing with counseling services, right? Get them out closer to where students are. Bring them into a place where they can see and be seen and feel like a resource. Ensuring that you have a good communication system, right? That's also important. Sometimes that does require capital improvements, but one of the things that we heard in the conversations with first responders is oftentimes we walk into buildings both in crisis mode and not in crisis mode, and we're blind. We can't hear each other, can't communicate with one another. The people in the building can't communicate, so I think that's also key. And then there are other elements that start to deal with sort of the mental health and safety or emotional safety of students. Gather all your teachers, put every kid in the building on the wall, and talk about them. Does somebody know this kid? And focus on the ones that no one knows, and connect with those kids intentionally and proactively. So I think it's one of the things that we talk about in terms of the approach is that it's not an either or, right? You are dealing with target hardening or providing more interventional strategies, but as important to that, if not more so, is addressing kind of those curative strategies. And those are human capital, which is already taxed in our schools, but at least it's free, right?
So, so adding on to that, because those are great elements that every school needs and should be doing on a continual basis, looking at how they're approaching these things. But if you take those 4 principles that I spoke about earlier, deter, detect, delay, and protect, your own staff, your own principals can look at your site and take a look. Is my perimeter cleared? If somebody walks onto my property, am I able to observe where they are going? Because the best way to defend or to protect is to have somebody knowing that when they step on your property that they can be observed. So it may be a simple matter of clearing out trees, looking where your sight lines are. I wouldn't be boarding up windows. I'd be opening up windows and making sure that I'm seeing out. So sometimes these schools, they have stuff all over your windows. And in the classrooms, I walk down hallways and they've got stuff stuck all over these interior windows. You may want to take those off and create some priorities and create some practices that your teachers have to follow through and take control of some of those areas. Sometimes it's just a personnel matter. People have locked doors around. You can lock all the doors around your building, but if people are letting others follow them through an entrance, that's the types of practices that you can stop. So there's a lot of things you can do before you get that beautiful grant funding, and you're able to do something really wonderful like they did in Sandy Hook.
Here's a question from online from Marcus. A lot of your designs appear to be in non-urban locations. How do you bring these same design philosophies to urban schools?
So the Franklin example is an urban example, but I think the most important elements are ensuring that you have a conversation in that community about what's right for that community, right? So oftentimes in our urban schools, we don't have quite the approach that you do have in these suburban schools, this beautiful long drive that they have at Sandy Hook. So it really is, in that case, about maintaining that control of the access point, being able to monitor the exterior doors on the ground floor to be able to ensure that at times of, when the building when students aren't arriving or leaving for the day, that you're able to control them and bring them in through the front door. Unfortunately, the history of these tragedies shows us that it oftentimes isn't a stranger to the building, that these are kids often that know the building and are in some cases even inside the building. So part of it is that layering approach, right? Being sure that you are providing layers, taking advantage of existing barriers you do have. In almost all cases, we did a really good job after a string of fires of designing our buildings to be able to withstand fires and be able to survive mass fires. We haven't had, I think, a death since by fire in schools in decades. And that's because there are resources in place. There are fire barriers. Take advantage of those and use those also as barriers that you can use to layer protection to delay people from getting further in and closer access to your kids.
Any other questions from the audience here?
Yeah. First of all, thank you. These ideas are really great. But I'm wondering if we have money for like 21st century grants that allow us to refurnish classrooms, and we do it one at a time. Are there any tips? You hear about things like, I don't know, bulletproof whiteboards and stuff. But I'm just wondering if we could use some of those funds, keeping an eye on safety.
Well, those are the type of things that are elements that are additive to a major scheme. You really still need to start from some type of master plan of where you want to go. And then if those elements are part of it, then they can be useful elements. But just to simply find products and put them in your schools, I don't think that's going to be suited for what you're going to need. So we don't have a list of products, because we tend to look at each school individually, urban, rural. The elementary schools like Sandy Hook, the danger is more from the outside. A high school, sometimes the danger is from the inside. So you have to look at each unique school and find the solutions for that one. So I really think you have to start with this committee, and that committee has to be as broad as possible of all those people that have stake in this game that we have here.
And I will say, I definitely agree that we have to be having conversations ahead of when we have the funding, but taking advantage of the funding that you do have, right? I mean, I think it's important. I think, first of all, it's critical, because what students tell us is a major way that they feel safe is when they have student choice about where they sit, where they are in the buildings. And so I would encourage you to think about them, to certainly, if you can provide that last barrier of defense and some of the technologies you're talking about, we're not going to tell you not to do that. But I think it is important to think about it in a more comprehensive way, right? So thinking about, where do you provide that furniture? Is it strictly in the classrooms, or are you also providing it in extended learning areas where you can create a stronger sense of connection and community, right? So taking advantage of the same funding, but where you choose to put that in the building, I think is as important as the furniture itself that you choose. Does that make sense?
Here's a question from online from Catherine. Our bond will partially redesign our elementary. How do we find equity in our campus even if we're not able to redesign our entire?
You want to start? This is not an uncommon question, because very rarely are we able to, when we're dealing with renovation, touch every piece, adequately. In that same district where we had at Trillium Creek, where we had the sort of tree house, we actually went into each of the elementary schools or primary schools in that district and provided an impactful change. In most cases focused around reimagining the library or media center, and creating a more open, connected community feel to that. So I think the big thing is have a conversation, facilitated conversation, and identify what your priorities are, right? Where do you want to, and where do you need to, just given the age of the building, need to expend those dollars, and then use that equity lens to say, okay, but what are our non-negotiables? What are we going to say every space in our building is going to, have natural light, be able to be secured without going outside of the classroom, for example. So I think prioritizing in a way that gets buy-in from your entire community through a facilitated conversation is where I'd start.
Another question from the audience? I'll go online. How can we have an inclusive design to our schools? Do we need to revise facility standards to ensure they're inclusive to promote mental health?
I think that answer is easily yes. I think the Sandy Hook School, I think, is a great example of this. As I mentioned earlier in my talk, there were all these concepts about building a fortress and having high windows and only internal courtyards, and really closing them off from the community. But by having this inclusive discussion, there was a 50-person building committee or a design committee that we worked with for that school. And that was a very diverse group: parents, teachers, neighbors, first responders, and all of them had to feel comfortable with where we were going. So if you gather these people together, and again, that's one of the architect's roles, is to gather this inclusive group and get them to open up and talk. And we have lots of exercises that we use to get people to to communicate and have these workshops and have manipulatives, things that people can do, similar to what people may do in their classrooms with teaching. You get everybody involved, and then you get the best answers. So everybody working together, you'll have the best solutions for these questions, these deep probing questions that you need, and they become inclusive to that particular school or that particular their community. And mental health is a big part of that.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the big issues that we're struggling with in the schools that we see relative to inclusivity is this issue of gender identity, right? Or just identity as a whole. And so inclusion of, or the revision of facility standards to include gender neutral facilities is really important for kids to feel seen, heard, and cared for. We see it, you know, it's been an evolving role as to how special education is provided to students, how they are brought into the community, created in more inclusive models. Universal design is a design strategy that starts to think about how we design such that all of our occupants can have ready access to. You know, it's not just about building a ramp around a back corner, but rather, you know, we all come in different shapes, different sizes, and different mobilities. And so we need to be able to ensure that our facility standards are addressing that entire continuum of the human experience, from our littlest kids all the way through higher ed. So those are two aspects that I'd focus on.
Any other questions here?
No, that just turned off. We got about 12 minutes.
Here's another one from online, and you guys may have already answered this, but I'm curious. It's from Bob. What? Oh, here it is. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, from Zach. For states and districts with limited resources, what do you see as the most cost-effective and practical way to modify schools physically to make them safer? Is there just a top, 3 things you really always want to keep an eye out for, or is it completely subjective, dependent upon the school?
Yeah, I think that's a very difficult question to answer because we don't know what the school is lacking. Yeah. When was this school built? Is it 100 years old? Is it 20 years old? Does it have multiple entrances? So you really have to evaluate, and it's not that expensive of a process to go in and evaluate these schools to see what your major weaknesses are. And then you can possibly find solutions that are not expensive, that really address, what's great is they can address not only the security aspect, but the environmental aspect of your building. So sometimes, as we mentioned, it's safer to make the building more open, which seems to be
counterintuitive.
Counterintuitive to the defensive postures that that some people may be speaking about.
I just want to say something
about
to that
the
point
checklist,
real
yeah.
quick. Karina, I remember you told me a story one time about, I think it was when you spoke at the Department of Homeland Security's their roundtables last summer in August, and how to Jay, you're talking about in terms of open spaces and so forth. But I think this was the event. It may have been another one, but regardless, I remember you telling me a story about how when y'all got in the room, there was a lot of talk about how we need to close in the school. We need to have less glass, less line of sight, et cetera. And by the end of the day, or at least that particular session, because of some input from y'all and several others, people were completely saying the opposite, which I think is interesting because it's one of those situations where you think but you may have no idea because of design solutions that have worked in other areas.
Yeah, I think it's a conversation around kind of creating those layers. I mean, you've heard us all talk about this layering. I don't think there are particular products or particular approaches that we would sit here and tell you those are the first things you should do because we don't know the condition of the existing school. I think access control, in however you define that, is one way to start, providing that layering, and then also thinking about ways you can build connection through glass and creating transparency and a sense of community in your school. So those would be my top pick.
Here's an interesting one. I'm going to modify it a little bit from Bob. What practical tips can you provide teachers about design when they aren't getting a new building He says that maximize learning, and I think that's a key point here, right? This isn't just about security. Everything you do has a duality to it. So it's safe, but also creating a great environment for learning, right?
Yeah, I mean, lest we forget that that's the point of school, right? You know, we're not here to design prisons that look really nice and you send kids there to learn. We're here to design places to inspire curiosity and wonder in our kids. So I'd say practically have the hard conversation about glass, because it's proven that when you can create extended learning areas or not in your classroom, but extend that learning into support spaces to be able to allow students to learn and do different activities in different groupings, in different settings, letting them choose their settings through the furniture that you talked about. That's key pedagogically. We are no longer, I would hope, in a situation where we're taking 30 kids and putting them in boxes along a corridor, right? Unfortunately, a lot of our schools still have that design, but even within that design, I think people are kind of breaking away from the sage on the stage and having everyone kind of collectively hearing them. And so being able to provide spaces to allow for different types of activities and having that flow seamlessly through the day, I think is really important. So we've moved away from designing for the number of students to designing for the activity that they're doing at that particular point in time. So that's the approach that we think matters.
Yeah, I think you can't add much more to that. It really is getting to the heart of what the children need, and we're learning more and more about that in all environments, from the elementary schools to the universities. Classrooms are being creating much more open and dynamic. The kids can move their own furniture around. The teachers really should be focusing on that, and then secondarily thinking about how they're designed, the rooms can be safe. I think the administration and the overarching organizations of these schools need to be focusing on that level.
Building on that, I think this will be our last question from online. This is a good point. You know, that idea again of, some of the school designs presented today displayed art on the walls. Yeah. What role does artwork play in school security? That might be surprising to people, how there's a relationship between artwork and school security, but how does that foster a more secure environment?
So one of the conversations that I remember having at the summit, and it was, I think, teachers from Sandy Hook that really brought that up, that having student displayed artwork in schools is a great way of building community, in the sense that it allows kids to feel more connected and have a sense of ownership over their space. It also provides for some of that calming. I mean, things as seemingly mundane as the color you choose to paint the walls can have a profound impact. And there's evidence around what are the colors that are calming. Where do you want to provide colors of heat or of energy? So art is a key component of creating that sense of warmth and welcoming that we want to create in our schools, and then also being able to leverage that to have the building reflect the students that are in that school at that time, so that way they can feel more strongly connected and create that shared sense of accountability I talked about earlier.
Yeah, no, and that's really where we focus on the art in our schools. At the Sandy Hook, you'll see that it's very natural. It's trees. It's figurative of the trees. There's stories of the original courtyard where the ducks used to come back every year. You see now the ducks flying through the building, really connecting it too. So while those may not be specific to security, they're specific to creating these next citizens of our country that are going to be connected to their communities, that they know that they're friends, they can rely on their friends, that the towns that they're from, so that we're not creating, we're preventing preventing making students that would act out, says the young man in Newtown.
And here's, I guess we'll do one last one. This one's a good point. And this one's for you, Jim, from Tracy Online. In terms of policy and advocacy, are there policy examples you can share? That's kind of a broad question. But in terms of if people are watching online, are going to be checking out, they want to dig more into this, I guess is the AIA website's a good spot, or can you talk a bit about anything on the horizon in terms of policy if people want to learn more?
Sure, absolutely. So actually I'm going to direct folks to what we call the Architect Action Center. And the reason I do that is because we need as many people as possible weighing in with Congress on this particular issues. And if you go to www.aia.org/takeaction, you'll see that on one of these boxes that's on our website, there's 6 boxes, is the school safety issue. And specifically, it talks about those 2 policy solutions that I was referencing earlier. And in terms of learning more about them, you can read more about that there. But 2, in terms of actually taking action and being able to either tweet directly at your member of Congress via that, clicking on that box and learning more, and then if you so feel compelled, tweeting at your member of Congress or emailing your member of Congress. This overall, being able to move the needle and get that systematic approach where we're prioritizing the redesign or the design of new schools, it's going to take more than architects. It's going to take folks who are beyond just our stakeholder group, and even beyond those who would be in that community meeting in terms of first responders and security consultants and members of the public. It's going to take people who may not be looking at school safety every day to realize that they need to weigh in with their elected officials on all levels, and really try to move the needle on this issue.
Great. All right, we're at time, guys. I want to thank our guests so much. Thank you guys for coming. I appreciate it.